It was early August of 2019 when I decided to accept my friend Mark's invitation to spend a long weekend at his family's lake house in upstate New York. I'd just gone through a stressful breakup, and the idea of escaping the noisy city, even briefly, felt like exactly what I needed. Mark assured me it would be peaceful. Just us, a couple of our other close friends, and nothing but trees, stars, and calm waters for miles around. We arrived on Friday evening, pulling up to an isolated wooden cabin nestled against thick, whispering trees. The lake stretched out behind the house, its still surface glinting beneath the fading sunlight. At first glance, it was exactly the kind of picturesque scene you'd imagine in a vacation brochure. But even as I stepped out of the car, something felt slightly off. The woods surrounding the house were unusually quiet. There were no birds, no insects chirping, just a heavy silence that settled over us like a woolen blanket. I brushed off the uneasy feeling, convincing myself I was just tired from the drive. We quickly settled in, joking around, grilling steaks by the lake and making plans to fish early the next morning. But even as we laughed and shared stories around the fire, I found myself constantly glancing toward the dark line of trees. It felt like something was watching from within their depths, hidden just out of sight. As night fell, we moved inside the cabin. It was old and rustic, with creaky floors and walls lined with faded photographs of people I'd never know. My room was small, with a single window overlooking the lake. From there I saw nothing but moonlit water stretching endlessly into the darkness. That first night, sleep came quickly. But at some point, a strange, scraping sound woke me. I lay still, half asleep, listening. It sounded like nails dragging slowly down wood, coming from the outside of my window. I forced myself to stand and peer outside, my heartbeat quickening, but nothing was there. Just empty lake and distant, shadowy trees. The next morning, I mentioned it to Mark, half-jokingly. He laughed, saying it must have been the wind. I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew wind couldn't make such a distinct scratching noise. The second night was worse. As I lay in bed, drifting uneasily between sleep and wakefulness, the scratching returned. This time, louder, sharper. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like fingernails dragging methodically against the wooden siding beneath my window. My heart started pounding. A cold sweat prickled down my spine. It took everything in me to get up and slowly pull back the curtain. Nothing was there. But then I looked down at the muddy ground beneath my window. Fresh, deep grooves had been carved into the earth as if someone or something had stood there digging their fingers into the soil. Panic tightened my chest. I stumbled back into bed, unable to sleep, heart racing, eyes fixed desperately on the door. By morning, exhaustion was weighing heavily on me. But when I went outside, the grooves were completely gone, vanished as if they'd never existed. My friends again dismissed my fears, but now I noticed unease behind their smiles, as though they too felt something they weren't admitting. On the third and final night, everything changed. I decided to stay awake, determined to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. Sitting on my bed, wrapped in a blanket, I stared at the window, waiting, my pulse pounding in my ears. It was around 2:30 a.m. when the scratching began again, louder this time. I shot up, breathing heavy, eyes locked on the window. Heart racing, I crept toward it, inch by painful inch. As I reached out to part the curtain, I saw a faint outline reflected in the moonlight. A dark figure standing motionless, barely visible at the edge of the trees. Frozen in fear, I watched as the figure suddenly darted forward, impossibly fast. In mere seconds, it crossed the distance between the trees and the cabin. My heartbeat roared as the shadowy form paused just below my window. It slowly lifted its head, revealing a face obscured by darkness, except for two glowing white eyes staring directly into mine. I staggered backward, a scream choking in my throat. I fumbled for the lamp beside my bed, flicking it on and flooding the room with harsh yellow light. Instantly, the figure vanished. Shaking uncontrollably, I ran into the main room. My friends were already awake, pale and terrified. Before I could speak, Mark pointed toward the lake. Standing on the shore, illuminated by moonlight, was the same dark figure. It stared silently at the cabin, motionless, watching us. We hurriedly packed our things, not daring to look outside again. The drive back to the city was silent. None of us knew who or what we'd seen, but the fear in our eyes was undeniable. Weeks later, back home, I tried convincing myself it had been some cruel prank or my imagination running wild. Then, one day, Mark called, voice shaking. He'd discovered an old newspaper article from 20 years ago. The headline made my blood run cold. Family vanishes without a trace at upstate lake cabin. In the photo, clear as day behind the cabin, was the shadowy figure that still haunts my nightmares. The cabin had been theirs, and whatever happened to them, whatever took them, had almost taken us, too. We never spoke of the lake cabin again, silently agreeing to let the memories fade into something distant. Months passed, and I did my best to move forward, finding comfort in the everyday hustle of my life. Then came the invitation, a weekend retreat to another lake, this one hidden deep in the Appalachian foothills of North Carolina. At first, I hesitated, immediately remembering that nightmarish experience in upstate New York. But my old college roommate, Eric, promised it was a quiet, safe place. A rustic cabin owned by his grandparents, completely isolated, surrounded by dense forests and untouched nature. Despite my reluctance, Eric assured me that nothing strange had ever happened there. This was simply a chance for us to relax, hike, and fish in peace. I agreed reluctantly, figuring I couldn't let fear control me forever. After all, lightning doesn't strike twice, right? The drive was peaceful, even beautiful. The deeper we traveled into the mountains, the more serene I began to feel. By late afternoon, we arrived at the lake, a picturesque body of water ringed by dense woods, serene and completely isolated. The cabin itself was old, but charming, nestled right at the water's edge, appearing straight from a postcard. We settled in quickly, unpacking our gear and exploring the grounds. But just like before, an unease crawled up my spine as the sun began to set. I found myself repeatedly glancing toward the thick trees surrounding us, wondering why they felt so watchful. I shook it off, dismissing it as leftover anxiety. After dinner, we built a fire outside, its flames crackling warmly against the chilly night air. For a moment, everything felt normal. We laughed, talked, and reminisced about our younger days, the warmth easing my tension. By midnight, everyone retired to their rooms, leaving me alone beside the fading embers. As I stared into the flames, that uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time. My gaze drifted to the small dock stretching out into the black water. There was something hypnotic about how still the lake was, like polished obsidian reflecting the sparse moonlight. Suddenly, a faint noise broke the silence. A soft splash, barely noticeable. I turned, scanning the lake's surface, but nothing moved. Just silence. Uneasy but curious, I stepped toward the water, peering into the darkness. The dock creaked beneath my feet, the sound louder than it should have been, as though something had stirred beneath the old planks. My heart quickened, though I saw nothing unusual. Still, the feeling of being watched intensified. Trying to shake off paranoia, I retreated inside the cabin and locked the doors securely. That night, sleep evaded me. Every tiny sound seemed amplified. The ticking clock, the settling cabin, the occasional rustle of leaves outside my window. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, but my dreams were twisted, filled with blurred shapes moving beneath dark waters, slowly reaching toward me. A sharp knock on my bedroom door jolted me awake at sunrise. It was Eric, another friend, urgently calling me to come outside. Still groggy, I followed him down to the dock, where he and the others were staring silently into the water, faces pale with shock. I peered down, and my stomach clenched painfully. Beneath the dock, submerged just a foot under the water's glassy surface, was an old rowboat, ancient and decaying, clearly untouched for decades. But that wasn't the disturbing part. Sitting upright in the boat, as though patiently waiting, was a figure. Its features were obscured by the dark water, but there was no mistaking the shape. It looked human. Before we could speak or act, another splash echoed from farther out, drawing our attention. I spun around, scanning the lake frantically. In the distance, a small ripple spread across the surface, but nothing else stirred. Fear seeped into our group, but Eric, always the rational one, insisted we were overreacting, that it was probably some strange prank. Desperate for answers, we tried contacting the owner of the cabin, but calls failed to connect, each ending in eerie static and silence. Night fell again, and I dreaded what it might bring. Sleep was impossible now. Instead, I sat by the window, staring into the shadows, unable to stop thinking about the boat hidden beneath the dock. Hours ticked by painfully slow, my eyes heavy but refusing to close. At last, exhaustion pulled me into a shallow sleep. Then came the dreams, dark, vivid images of people I'd never seen, silently watching me from the shore, their eyes hollow and pleading. I woke with a jolt, drenched in cold sweat, heart racing. Outside it was pitch black, but an instinct compelled me to look toward the lake. My heart froze. Standing on the dock was a single figure silhouetted clearly against the moonlight. It was motionless, facing away, staring silently out over the lake. My blood ran cold when I realized it wasn't anyone from our group. Paralyzed, I watched helplessly as the figure stepped forward, dropping silently into the water, leaving barely a ripple. Panicking, I rushed outside, screaming for the others. We searched the lake frantically but found nothing. No body, no sign of disturbance, just silence and smooth black water. Trembling and confused, we packed up at dawn and left immediately, unable to bear another night. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the experience. Driven by a restless need to understand, I searched the history of the area. My heart nearly stopped when I uncovered an obscure local legend about the lake. Over a century ago, a young woman drowned herself after losing her entire family in a fire, promising she'd never rest peacefully. The worst part? People claimed that those who encountered her boat or saw her ghostly form on the dock vanished soon after, never to be seen again. As I finished reading, the room spun around me and my phone buzzed loudly. A text message from Eric. "Have you seen Kevin?" He's not answering. I felt a chill sink deep into my bones. Months passed, and as much as I tried to push away the memories from that cursed lake in North Carolina, the nightmares persisted. I struggled to convince myself it was all a coincidence or an elaborate trick my mind had played on me. So when my friend, Laura, invited me to spend the weekend at her family's lakeside cabin near Lake Tahoe, Nevada, I hesitated. Eventually, desperate to overcome my fears, I agreed, foolishly hoping that this time would be different. The lake house was breathtaking. A charming old cabin nestled among towering pines, overlooking water so calm it resembled glass. When I arrived, the place radiated warmth, inviting comfort. Laura reassured me that her family had owned it for generations without a hint of trouble. Yet, deep down, something felt strangely familiar, almost ominous. The first day passed without incident. We swam in the lake, cooked together, and sat around the fire, laughing, telling stories until our eyes grew heavy. But even as I smiled and shared jokes, an uneasy feeling gnawed at my stomach. As the sun set, turning the water a deep, unsettling shade of crimson, I found myself glancing nervously at the tree line. It was like the forests at the other lakes, silent, watchful, and disturbingly still. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned for hours, haunted by vague dreams of shadowy figures standing motionless at the water's edge. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under, but a sudden sound yanked me awake. It was distant, barely audible, a quiet, rhythmic tapping, gentle, but unmistakably deliberate. I strained my ears, heart thudding. The tapping was steady, deliberate, echoing softly from somewhere outside. Unable to resist, I rose from bed, compelled to discover its source. Barefoot, I crept through the dark house, the wooden floor cold beneath my feet. Each creak made me flinch, my pulse quickening with every step. Reaching the front window, I peered carefully through the curtain. At first, I saw nothing but moonlight shimmering faintly on the lake's surface. My eyes adjusted slowly, scanning the shore. Then my breath caught sharply. Standing at the edge of the water was someone, or something, completely still, just staring at the cabin. It was a woman, long dark hair hanging limply over a pale face, eyes hollow and lifeless, unmoving. My heart leaped into my throat. She seemed translucent, barely real, yet her presence felt terrifyingly tangible. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were betraying me. But when I opened them again, the figure had moved. Closer, now halfway between the lake and the cabin, though I never saw her take a step. My knees felt weak. Desperate to believe this wasn't real, I backed away, stumbling to my room, locking the door behind me and hiding beneath my sheets. Morning arrived, mercifully bright and clear. I was too embarrassed to mention what I'd seen, certain they'd dismiss me as paranoid. Throughout the day, I distracted myself, swimming and hiking, praying my fears would fade. But as dusk approached, anxiety clawed its way back into my chest. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the lake in eerie shades of purple and black, reigniting my dread. Later that night, determined to face whatever was tormenting me, I stayed awake, sitting stiffly on the edge of my bed, waiting. The hours dragged painfully by, silence filling the room, until I heard something unmistakable, a gentle tapping sound, rhythmic, coming from the porch outside. My breath quickened, heart pounding against my ribs. Slowly, I moved toward the door, gripping the knob tightly, hesitating before pulling it open. Standing directly outside, illuminated in pale moonlight, was Laura. Her eyes were wide and terrified, her skin pale as chalk. She pointed behind me with a trembling finger, her voice barely a whisper, filled with fear. Confused, I turned slowly and saw the front window, the same one I'd looked through the night before. There, inside the house, standing motionless in the exact spot I'd occupied earlier, was the spectral woman I'd seen by the lake. Her empty gaze fixed directly on us, lips moving silently, mouthing words I couldn't hear. Terror surged through my body, paralyzing me. Laura grabbed my hand, pulling me away, her breathing ragged. We ran blindly toward the car parked down the dirt driveway, gravel crunching loudly beneath our feet. Glancing back, I saw the front door slowly closing on its own, the figure nowhere to be seen. Shaking violently, I scrambled into the passenger seat as Laura started the engine. Tires spun violently as we sped away from the cabin, heartbeats pounding in sync. Neither of us spoke, too frightened, too uncertain of what had happened. It felt like an eternity before we reached the safety of the nearest town, where we parked in front of a brightly lit gas station, desperate to feel some normalcy. For several minutes we sat silently, catching our breath, trying to process the horrifying events. Finally, Laura confessed something that froze my blood in my veins. She told me that decades earlier, her great-aunt, barely older than us, had mysteriously drowned in the lake. Her body was never found, though locals whispered she haunted the shoreline ever since. Her family never mentioned it openly, afraid of acknowledging the sinister legacy of the lake house. Chills cascaded down my spine. But before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket. An unknown number flashed across the screen. Instinctively, I answered, my hand trembling. The line crackled with static before a faint voice broke through, distorted and distant. "I told you not to leave." The call abruptly disconnected. I stared at Laura, eyes wide with dread. In that moment, we both knew we'd escaped nothing. Something had followed us, something relentless and unforgiving. And worst of all, as I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, I realized the voice had been my own. After everything I experienced at those lakes, I realized some nightmares don't end when you wake up. They linger, seeping into your daily life, twisting reality until you're no longer sure what's safe or what's real. Sometimes, the stories we tell ourselves to forget the horrors only make them stronger. If you've ever felt a chill down your spine or had an experience you can't explain, you're not alone. If you enjoyed these true lake horror stories, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more chilling tales. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss what comes next.